All right, so continuation on of how ecosystems work. Last lecture, we talked about energy. Today, we're going to focus on the nutrient part of it. Remember, the energy are the bonds and the nutrients are the atoms. So when you take a look at something like this, like a simple amino acid, again, when we're looking at this, the bonds, that's the energy, they break, energy is released into the ecosystem, energy goes down and down and down, it gets used or lost as heat at every step of the conversion of energy, and then what you're left with are the atoms, the hydrogens, the nitrogens, the carbons, oxygens, whatever's in this R group, which defines the amino acid. And then those go into the ground, the air, rocks, soil, and those are utilized by our producers to be recycled and then back into the trophic levels, recycled by the D&Ds, the detritivores, and the decomposers, and then back into our producers. We're going to take a look at nutrient cycles. We call them biogeochemical cycles. So you can break this down. There's bio, living things, and then geo is kind of like the earth or the abiotic factors. And the chemicals is referring to the atoms or the nutrients. So what this term, biogeochemical cycle, is indicating that those atoms go into living things, and then living things use the energy that holds the atoms together, and then the nutrients go into the ground, the chemicals, and they're taken back up by the living things, and we have this cycling between biotic and abiotic of these chemicals or atoms. So first example, one we like to start with in biology is the carbon-based types of nutrients. What makes something organic is that it is a molecule that has carbon bonded to hydrogen. That's the definition of organic. So if we think about carbon dioxide, CO2, has carbon, but is it bonded? Is that carbon bonded to a hydrogen? It's not. So carbon dioxide is an abiotic factor, whereas something like this amino acid, because you have carbon bonded to hydrogen, it makes this an organic molecule. Carbon has a number of ways of entering into our system. One is just the act of breathing, that as we take in oxygen from our producers, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide goes back into the producers. Also, carbon is passed through the energy systems by the bonds that hold things like that amino acid together. As you eat something that like a producer, or you eat something that ate a producer, you get some of those carbons also. So we've got a variety of ways to get carbon in. So carbon is through either breathing, it's brought into the system, or through the food web, and then eventually the carbons are recycled by the D&Ds, the decomposers, and the detritivores. So respiration, using oxygen to break down our food, gives off carbon dioxide. So we've got a little bit of a combination with carbon in our energy and nutrient system with the act of breathing, because cellular respiration is the process of using oxygen to efficiently break down our energy sources. Also, carbon can be in water. Water is a good sink for carbon dioxide. Some of that carbon, it is harnessed by our mollusks and other shelled organisms that will take some of that carbon, go through a metabolic pathway to combine with calcium, and it makes their hard shells. Chicago is sitting on an ancient coral reef. We have a lot of limestone in the Chicago area, so there was a lot of water here at one point. Eventually, these shells will decompose into these hard structures of calcium carbonate. We also use carbon in the production, or carbon is produced in the production of fossil fuels. that as we burn oil, gas, and coal, carbon dioxide is given off. We know that's one of the big issues with climate change, which we're going to talk about today, is that release of excess amounts of carbon dioxide through the ways that we fuel our world. Remember that when we're talking about fossil fuels, right there in the name, fossil means an ancient, dead, living thing, that we make our fuels off of that. Fossil fuels are a non-renewable source because we only have so many past dead things. So the idea to think about renewable energies is really, really important. So this is the carbon cycle. You can see that there's a lot of arrows going on, that carbons, we have one way that they come in is through respiration, that as we respire, we give off carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we also pass carbon through, harnessed by photosynthesis. That photosynthesis provides that oxygen and those energy sources through the food web, that we can pass those carbons through what we eat, and then also through breaking down those energy sources and respiring. The detritivores and the decomposers are going to take all of these carbons through the food web, and they're going to bring them back to the producers. And then there's other ways that we produce carbon. We said through the burning of our fuels. Fires also cause a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So as we have more of those forest fires, just natural fires or human-induced fires in the world, that we get extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And another way is through factories, that as factories produce whatever they're producing, they'll give off carbon dioxide in the production of that. Second example, nitrogen. Let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. This I always think is so fascinating. Nitrogen makes up about 79% of our atmosphere. So as you are breathing in air, 79% of that is nitrogen gas. The problem with nitrogen gas is that we can't fix it. And when I mean fix, the term fix in biology means attach. We can't attach it into our system and get nitrogen. Nitrogen is really, really, really important. It's critically important as a part of our DNA, our genetic material, our RNA. It is the transcript of our genetic material, and proteins, which proteins make up a lot or a majority of the very important things in our cells that function. Again, we can't fix that. When we say we can't extract, when we're talking about extraction or grabbing that nitrogen, it means, if you hear the word fix in biology or chemistry, it means grab onto it and take it and use it. We do not have the ability to fix nitrogen. So what does it? Bacteria that are in a symbiotic relationship with plants can fix nitrogen and pass it over to our producers. The producers produce our food, and so in our food sources, we get that nitrogen. Nitrogen is passed through the food webs and then recycled by the D&Ds. Here again, we have certain bacteria that can do nitrogen fixation. They can extract that nitrogen and make it available to other organisms. So here's our nitrogen cycle. Again, most of it is going to be happening here with our producers. The nitrogen fixing bacteria in soil is going to give it over to the producers. They're going to pass it through the food web. It's going to be recycled by the D&Ds and then brought back into those nitrogen fixing, or brought over to those nitrogen fixing organisms. We also have ammonia and nitrates in water that build up, and they can be what we have denitrifying bacteria, and they can take those nitrogens out and they can put it back in the soil, and then can be taken up by our nitrogen fixing bacteria. Very similar in the way that this happens. Other ways that we get nitrogen into our system is through lightning storms. That lightning will cause some of that atmospheric nitrogen to be brought into or released into the system. The burning of fossil fuels is another way that we have nitrogen become available. There's other important biogeochemical cycles. We can go through a lot of them. I'm just going to mention two more. One is phosphorus. Phosphorus is another important atom or nutrient in DNA, RNA, proteins. Of course, other things. The way that we get phosphorus into our cycle is that phosphorus is in rocks, and rocks will leach that into the soil, which is then taken up by our producers. The hydrological cycle, water, hydro, water. The main way that water is brought in and out of our system is through precipitation and evaporation. Precipitation and evaporation of water is driven by solar energy. We know now as it's getting warmer in our ecosystem, we're turning a little toward the earth again. We're turning toward the sun again, and we're getting more sunlight. We're also getting a lot more precipitation and evaporation during this time. We often see it also heavy in the summers as well. Remember that water is critically important to living things, that water facilitates the metabolic reactions of making and breaking all of our molecules. So hence why, if you are an organism and you are dehydrated, everything's going to slow down. It's not going to be good. You can die from dehydration because you are not allowed to produce all of your metabolic pathways in your body. And our metabolic pathways, they make everything go, go, go in our body. So without water, living things can die. All right, so just as a recap, remember that nutrients are recycled. The hydrogens, the carbons, the phosphorus, the nitrogens, the oxygens, all of those are recycled through our system. They keep moving through our system. Remember that energy is utilized and becomes less and less and less. With every conversion of energy, we lose the majority of that energy as heat. Don't forget this important number, that there is a 10% law when we're talking about energy, that 10% of it is utilized and 90% of it is lost. All right, here's a big question. Are humans messing up all of these nutrient cycles? Yeah, for sure, right? So we know that they're messing it up. We're going to talk about some depressing things, but then we're also going to focus on some of the solutions that are happening and really exciting things that are happening out there. So of course, we have this huge reliance on fossil fuel. I know I mentioned this when we talked about protists and biofuel, that if any of you can crack how to make biofuel more efficient, you're going to solve a lot of our reliance on fossil fuels. We also get a lot of extra nutrients from runoff. When we're talking about runoff, we're talking a lot about farms, as well as farms, what's happening in the earth from pesticides, insecticides, and other kinds of nutrients that are given to animals and plants can run off into our water systems, but also here, when we're talking about factories, they can release chemicals as they make all the stuff that they make, in addition to carbon dioxide and nitrogens into the atmosphere. These chemicals, they eventually get brought down into our system through precipitation and cycle precipitation and evaporation and make their way into our soil and water systems. Okay, so a few things about these terms. Global warming and climate change. So if we could go back to hearing a president talk about the importance of limiting our effects of using fossil fuels back to Jimmy Carter. He was one of the first presidents who was like, we really need to get off our reliance on fossil fuels. We have to change our ways. And back then, everybody who was studying this, they called this reliance and the effects of the reliance on fossil fuels global warming. Because as people were observing that we had more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, we had a correlation with the warming of our Earth. And so we saw this correlation. And they thought, oh, that is causing the globe to warm more. Now, what we know as a result of the increasing amounts of carbon dioxide and other climate change gases is that it's not just that the Earth is warming, but there are other things that are happening. Like some very few places on the Earth get colder as a result of this. There's also a lot more water going up and coming down. The water isn't always equal in where it comes up and goes down. So in some places you see a lot of water coming out of a system and it gets droughts, and you see a lot of water coming way down and you can get floods, mudslides. We also see that based on these big shifts in water on our Earth, the tectonic plates, our continents are moving, but a little bit faster and quicker in short periods of time to cause things like earthquakes and tsunamis. We also see a lot more water going up in places which cause hurricanes. And so we have all of these things that are happening at once. And so now a modern term for global warming is really climate change. So just to kind of understand that the linguistics of this is that we started there with global warming, but as more scientists studied, they said, nah, it's not just about warming, and it's not all just warming. Some places are getting cooler, but not many. So climate change is what we described. All right, so a little more about our Earth is that as carbon dioxide and other climate change gases go into our atmosphere, we get a lot more heat. Again, then I just explained heat can cause all kinds of things with water, shifting of tectonic plates, changes in our ecosystems. So our Earth, one of the things that's really unique about our Earth is our Earth has an atmospheric bubble. Our atmospheric bubble, it holds heat onto the Earth. That has made it historically just the perfect thing, and especially in relationship to the length we are from the sun with our bubble, that heat being held in, it allows for living things to thrive and be protected. So we have this great thing. The problem now with our reliance on fossil fuel, all of our brain development has caused us to make these technological advances and how we utilize energy, and the carbon dioxide and other climate change gases are getting stuck in our bubble. So that as we get more carbon dioxide, and we'll talk about methane also and other climate change gases as well, it causes our bubble to take that heat and hold it in. And we're getting hotter, and it's causing chaos to happen. So we do see a definite correlation between increases in carbon dioxide, one of the many greenhouse gases. We relate this to a greenhouse because our bubble, which holds heat, if you've ever gone into a plant conservatory or a greenhouse, you walk in and you notice a few things. It gets a little bit warmer than it is outside. Near my house is the Garfield Park Conservatory. I love to go there. It's a beautiful place. And in the winter, you can walk in and it feels warm inside, even though it's all glass. Carbon dioxide increasing, as well as other climate change gases, have a correlation with increased global temperatures. There is tons and tons and tons of data. So when people say, I don't believe in climate change or global warming, it's not a belief. There's data. We have data to support this idea here. Okay, so this is just showing you all of the places that we have contributions to the warming of our Earth, our vehicle emissions. This is an interesting one, agricultural activity. This very specifically relates to methane gas. We remember a little bit about when we talked digestive system, that cows eat mostly grass, and grass has a lot of cellulose or fiber in it. And when you eat a lot of fiber, there's bacteria, and especially cows have a lot of bacteria that produce cellulase to help break down the cellulose, but also that causes a lot of gas to be produced. And the cows end up burping a lot. When they burp, they bring their food back into their mouth and give it another chew. And that methane that they burp out is the second leading impactful climate change gas. And so one of the things that a lot of people who do research on our food system say is that if we just ate less meat or no meat, that climate change would be in control. So kind of interesting that our food system has a big effect on this. Other ways that we use our energy that produce carbon dioxide and other climate change gases in our homes and buildings. There's so many ways that we use energy inside power plants and factories. Volcanoes can give off gases that will contribute to climate change. And also we're seeing a lot more volcanic activity, which is in relationship to those tectonic plates moving. Forest fires, natural or man-made. And then we have all of these are adding climate change gases into the atmosphere. And we have our bubble where they are not released, but they are held and cause that warming and shifts in our ecosystems. Another thing that happens is deforestation contributes to climate change producing gases. This is like a double, they call it a double-edged sword, because what happens with deforestation is that usually when we have deforestation, it's happening in our rainforest areas of the world where we have the most diversity of our autotrophs, the very things that can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They go and they usually, instead of cutting everything down, because that's very labor intensive, they just burn it. And so in burning that, they burn all of the autotrophs, but also they're going to burn a lot of the heterotrophs, those organisms, the fungi and the protists and the plant, and the animals that are eating the autotrophs. A lot of them will die in this. And so when they burn them, it gives off mass amounts of carbon dioxide. So here you have a system where they're burning the very things that can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And when you're burning them, you're giving off massive amounts of carbon dioxide. So it doesn't really make any sense. But it's all about a business deal and the bottom line, because what they're going to do in these deforested areas is they're going to plant one thing. It's usually a monoculture, one kind of thing, monoculture. And like they'll be like, I want to plant pineapples here. And they plant pineapples or strawberries and they grow that one specific thing. And then after a number of years, that land, all the nutrients are gone. And then they go and they buy more rainforest and do the same thing and leave all of that used land to die. So big idea here. More carbon dioxide, methane, other climate change gases that are put into the atmosphere through all of the things I just mentioned. I mean, higher temperatures. Higher temperatures are going to drive hydrological cycles, which mean that, like, for example, we're already getting into hurricane season in our side of the world. We're going to have a lot more hurricanes, which we know in the last 10 years. I think out of the last 10 years, 9 of them have been the worst hurricane seasons ever. So there are correlations with these temperatures and cycles being changed. Okay, here's the other thing. This is my I'm sure all of you have read the data and find the support in that all of these extra gases are causing climate change to happen. But when people say I don't believe in climate change, my first thing is it's always been happening. The climate has always been changing. We've had warm periods and we've had icy periods. We've had ice ages and warm, right? The climate's always been changing. If we go back 4 billion years, the Earth was mostly covered in water. That's very different It's a very different climate than what we live in now, right? So it's always been happening. But we are seeing cycles happen faster than we ever had in the history of the Earth. So just like I said with the hurricanes, a lot more hurricanes with a lot more of these climate changing gases. So here's two graphs. One is the global temperatures since the 1960s, and this is carbon dioxide since the 1960s. Do they produce an average same curve shape? Are they both going up? Okay, so when you lay them on top of one another, here's what you see. And this produces a correlation that the carbon dioxide rising affects the temperature rising, that they do correlate or go together. This one goes back to the 1860s, this particular study, but they have looked at ice cores, so they've gone up to cold places in the earth, and they've taken these long poles that they hammer into the ground, and they grab a core of ice, and from that core of ice, they can look at the amounts of carbon dioxide dissolved in every level of that ice, and so we have thousands of years of support for the change in carbon dioxide over time as well. And there is a correlation with temperature changes. So this one is the air bubbles in the ice cores. This one goes back 8,000 years. And so again, you can see, okay, yeah, it's going up slowly 8,000 years ago. So we did have a natural warming cycle before we got all this modern technology. When we got here to the Industrial Revolution, we see Industrial Revolution, that there is a huge impact. And again here, this one goes back, ice cores back 800,000 years ago. And so there's a lot of people who studied this in a lot of different ways. I just like to show you a variety of different studies so that if there's ever, maybe you were like, I'm not sure, there's so much data to support this. There's been so many people studying climate change. Okay, so as a result of that, we know that we're losing a lot of our permanent ice stores in the north and south parts of our Earth. When the icebergs melt, we get rises in the oceans. Every day I read about something about some community being affected by rising water, and that they're trying to figure out, what do we do? There's many, many, many island nations, island communities where their houses are being infringed upon, and they're trying to figure out, what do we do? We've had this culture here for thousands of years on this island. This is our home, our historical home. What do we do? Okay, so allergies. Anybody's allergies gone crazy? Yeah, so like I know you can 8 o'clock in the morning class, my voice gets really goofy. After I'm done with this class, my voice is fine because all of the allergy issues that I'm working out since sleeping horizontally, it's all starting to drain out. It also can cause a lot of psychological issues. Reading about all of these bad things that are happening is very depressing. I know as I go through the news, I'm like, oh my gosh, right? I mean, every day we're being bombarded with bad news after bad news after bad news. Disaster. It's like you can't even remember the last disaster because a new one is here today. Weather patterns are changing, most definitely. We were just talking about this. If you like to plant vegetables or plants at this time of year or into the summer, that they're starting to revise what you can plant in our area because it is getting warmer. So we're actually getting more availability for some things and less availability for some things that do better in colder temperatures. I also read that usually they say like you can plant your tomatoes and other more fragile fruits and vegetables at this time of like in May, used to be like May 15th. After that should be the last time it freezes and you could plant your tomatoes, for example. And now they're saying like, no, go ahead, start planting them. We shouldn't have a freeze before the 1st of May now. So things are changing. Oh, and this one is also, I mean, we have a million reasons why we have refugees, but also in addition to politics, that we're getting a lot of what we call climate refugees, that as disasters are happening, people are moving. Like people who lived in New Orleans during the Katrina hurricane, that they had to move out of that area, and people were taking them in all over the United States, and then they eventually either moved back or settled somewhere else. So we have climate refugees that we also have to think about. This is the Muir Glacier. So back in 1941, they didn't have a color picture, but this is all glacier. This is all ice. Same picture that you can see back here. So here's that mountain here, up to here, all turns into water. It's melted. And that's just one of many examples that they have. And here you can see that this is an even more modern picture. It's all water. There's no ice at all. And the floods and the landslides. This is Maui, if you remember the big fire that happened. Okay, so some bad news. Now we're going to talk about solutions to this. I think we have a little more bad news and then solutions, but I like to focus on the solutions. So also we're going to look at just a little briefly of different kinds of ecosystems. All right, a little more bad news. So let's talk about the ozone layer. So we have a couple different kinds of bubbles that form our atmosphere. One keeps the heat in. Another filters harmful UV rays. That's called the ozone layer. I was just talking about this with my son because this weekend we were at a tournament all weekend. He plays lacrosse. And I was like, we got to put on sunscreen. Sun, even though it was pretty cloudy, I was like, we should put on sunscreen. He's like, we don't need it yet. And I was like, yes. He put on sunscreen. All of his teammates who didn't put on sunscreen were burnt really badly. So you have to remember that even when it's a cloudy day, I mean, not quite like this, but when it's partially sunny, got to put on sunscreen. And everybody, regardless of how much melanin that you have, meaning the darker your skin, everybody has become way more susceptible to skin cancer. So, like, best thing you could do is find a lotion at least every day, a lotion you get up, you put on your face, and has at least like 15 to 30 SPF in it, that it's naturally in there, and every day you walk out the door and you've got a little bit of protection on you. So, UV rays are filtered out by the ozone. Ozone is 3 oxygens covalently bonded to one another. This bubble protects us from the harmful UV rays. Harmful UV rays for biological molecules in small doses is really good. In small doses, it produces vitamin C. It helps to promote a metabolic pathway in our bodies that allows us to produce vitamin D. So in very small amounts. But in bigger amounts, it can cause burns. Sunburn means that you are literally cooking yourself with the sun. You're burning yourself. There are many different kinds of cancers. And then this one, cataracts, which often we might think of cataracts as a change to the eye as you get older and older, that we're thinking like maybe like people in their 70s, 80s, 90s are having cataract surgery. People who work outside are having cataract surgeries in their 30s and 40s now, that we're seeing this whole epidemic. So really have to be careful. So a couple things. I said the lotion, make sure you have a sunscreen maybe in your car. The other thing is sunglasses, is that everybody should wear sunglasses when you're outside, and make sure when you look at your sunglasses, they say 100% protective against UVA, UVB, and it's got to say both of those. You can find them for 10, 15 bucks at Target. So they don't have to be expensive, but it is really important to protect your eyes. Your eyes are a lot more susceptible than anything else in your body. All right, so The ozone layer, the thinning of it has been seen to be most severe over Antarctica. And there's this hole in the ozone layer that, depending on the weather, it opens and then it closes up. And so it kind of morphs throughout the year. But the ozone layer is about 4% thinned out. Do I have that on there? It's about 4%. I don't have the statistic, but it's about 4% reduced over the whole world. So we're all not getting as much protection. All right, so what is causing this deterioration of the ozone layer? The way that we have produced things like foam plastics, so think about styrofoams, coolants for our refrigerators, other kinds of plastics and foams and aerosols, they release what are called CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons. The chlorofluorocarbons take about 50 years to reach the ozone layer. So just think about 50 to 100 years. So just think about like what happened 100 years ago. Those are just getting up to our ozone layer. These CFCs cause the ozone layer, the O3, to break down into O2s. And if you think, well, that's great, then we have more oxygen, but we're okay on oxygen. We want that O3. Back in 1986, a bunch of nations got together and said, this is becoming a scary problem. We have the research and ability to change aerosols, foam plastics, refrigerant coolants to not give off CFCs. So let's all agree that we are going to change our systems to not give off CFCs. So that was a really good thing. It was a good compact that they all agreed to. But again, as I mentioned, it takes 50 to 100 years for the CFCs to get up there. So here's the other thing, is that as nations are developing, they start with the cheaper old ways. And so they weren't part of the compact back then, and so they're using them. So then it's got to get to them to start changing their ways too. But again, this is like more expensive, and they're developing, so they want to come on board with everybody else. So it's pretty tough system. They have seen, though, that impacts are changing in a positive way. And so we are seeing a positive result of this compact here. But again, like we still got to see what's coming. So kind of the happy part of this is it's working. Our changes are working. All right. Tropical rainforests are one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. I already talked about this, so I'm going to be very brief. Some companies will use the lumber or trees, but again, some will just burn it all down for the sake of planting a monoculture. The other thing that people thought, and this I think is kind of a fascinating idea, is that the nutrients and energy in rainforests, because there are so many organisms. And remember the D&Ds, how they really surround that whole trophic pyramid, that there are so many of them that as soon as something dies or there's waste, all of those nutrients are sucked up and they're put right back into the producers, which are passed through the food system. And so we have this very quick cycling. What that means is that the nutrients that the D&Ds are putting into the soil, they don't stay there very long. So a lot of people had the perception that if we tear down the rainforest, we'll have this really rich soil to grow our monoculture, and our monoculture can last for maybe like 30 years. But then they started to figure out like, oh, because of the diversity of the rainforest, that most of the nutrients were actually in organisms, and we burned all those organisms, that the soil, it didn't support their monoculture for more than maybe like about 5 years. And then they moved to somewhere else. So kind of an interesting discovery that still people are not using that data to change their ways. All right, so we talked about a lot of this. One thing I just want to point out, that at least a third of rainforests, it's almost closer to a half, between a third and a half are gone at this point. All right, I think this is the last bit of bad news. So acid rain. Acid rain, so it's clearly going to rain today. when it rains and you walk outside and you get hit with that water, do you feel like your skin is going to burn off? Right? So we don't feel acid and acid rain. It is actually a very small percentage. Places like New Jersey, where there are just a lot of factories, or if we look at some of the cities in big Southeast Asian countries where they produce a lot of that like cheap plasticky stuff that is sold all over, like a place like Temu, for example, that those places where there are factories, there's more acid in the water or the rain. Still not to the point where it's going to burn your skin off, but who's going to feel the acid in the acid rain? And let me say the acid is, it is sulfuric acid and nitric acid. These are things that are given off in the production of those like cheap plasticky things. So in addition to the carbon dioxide that a factory is given off, these things are also given off into the atmosphere. The small percentage of acid that's in acid rain has a bigger effect on smaller organisms. The smaller organisms would be our decomposers and our detritivores. So especially when we're talking about fungi and bacteria, who are the base of those DNDs, they are going to be harshly affected by acid rain. Now, what happens if they all start to die? If our DNDs, that community, which is bigger than our trophic levels, if they start to collapse, there's nobody to recycle nutrients back to the autotrophs, which means food is limited throughout the system. There's also going to be less organisms that are going to recycle nutrients and also break down waste and dead things. So we're going to have a really disgusting ecosystem. Everything's going to start to starve if this gets very severe. And then also you're going to have less recycling of dead and waste. The other thing about these acids is they also glom onto things like chloride and heavy metals, which accelerate biomagnification as well. So you've got destruction of the DNDs, biomagnification, you've got a lot of different systems that are affected by this. So here's some areas like New Jersey, for example. I'll use that. Forests around New Jersey, trees often will look like this. Trees are usually like dark brown. That bark layer is very dark. But what they're seeing is the acid over time, the rain, is causing the bark layers to die, to come off. If we think about trees, in the bark layer is the phloem. Remember, phloem is our tube system that when the leaves, which photosynthesize, create sugar and other metabolic energy sources, that they go down the tree to the roots. If the phloem in the bark layer is burnt off, that tree cannot feed itself and its roots. And so those trees all start to die. So not only are they just ugly, but they die over time because they do not have their energy sources. So you can see whole forests where a lot of trees are falling down because their roots are not being fed and the trees are white. There's no bark. There are a lot of people who are studying this. They're going out into these forests and streams and they're taking a lot of data to try and figure out what's going on and how to fix it. Okay, so now we're on to our more positive news. First, we're going to take a look at all of the different ecosystems in our biosphere. Our biosphere is like the biggest part of ecology. It's all of the ecosystems on the earth. So it kind of makes sense. Bio, living, where all the living things live. Sphere, round, earth. We have another name for ecosystems, which is biomes. Biomes. That means all the areas that living things are found. All right, biogeography. So living and non-living things. Biogeography is the study of the distribution of living things and the abiotic factors that affect them. So you could be somebody who studies both like more natural science and biology or ecology together and be what's called a biogeographer. This picture, so this person could be considered a biogeographer. They might be studying the chemicals and then how they affect the living thing. So it's kind of like a new term for an ecologist. There's a lot of different kind of specializations within ecology. Biogeography is one of them. So let's take a look at the different biomes. Biomes are categorized based on two things, weather and climate. Weather is like what's happening right now. Our weather just changed. It's pouring out there. Weather is a daily thing. Climate is historic. What does a typical spring look like here? What does a typical summer look like? Winter, fall. That's your climate. Trends that happen over longer periods of time. Biomes or ecosystems are classified based on their plant communities. With changes to the climate, most animals, maybe other organisms can kind of move out of the ecosystem, but plants can't get up and walk away. You might see like their pollen drift, but they can't move. So that's why we categorize by plants. This plant, for example, is called a silver sword. This plant is found on one mountain, one volcano in Hawaii. It's the only place it's found. So this, when you see this, they say that's this specific kind of ecosystem or biome. All right, we're going to take a look at North America since we live over here right now. You'll see a lot of different versions of this map, what biomes exist and where. Sometimes some of these are called different names in different textbooks. Sometimes the regions are maybe a little different. So just know that this is kind of one version of many that are out there. Okay, so in addition to the biomes that we're going to look at in North America, there are all kinds of other biomes in the world. North America doesn't represent all of them. We are not close to the equator. When you get closer to the equator or you get further from the equator, you have very specific different kinds of biomes. So again, just wanted to point out that when we're looking at our biomes where we live right now, it doesn't represent all of them. Biomes, again, or ecosystems are limited by energy and nutrients. The two most diverse ecosystems, two of the most diverse, are rainforests and coral reefs. They exist in an area, it's like 30 degrees north and south of the equator is where you find them. Should give you the idea when we talked about nutrients and nutrient flow and energy, that primary productivity revolves around things like amount of water, temperature, nutrient availability, and availability of sunlight. So it would make sense that these are closer to the equator, where you're going to have copious amounts of those four factors. Oh, I just read, terrible story about the Great Barrier Reef. They're coming off the end of their summer right now. They had one of the worst bleaching incidences. Bleaching is when the little tiny mutualistic organism called zooxanthellae, they leave the coral. Zooxanthellae, they produce about 90% of the coral's energy. So when they leave because it gets too hot or they're spit out, whatever that mechanism is, that the corals have to make up that other 90% of energy that the zooxanthellae were providing them, and then a lot of them end up dying. And what you're left with are the white skeletons that the corals release underneath themselves. There's been all kinds of other diseases as well that are found on coral reefs, that as you have warming temperatures, diseases are more abundant as well. So there's lots of things to study here. Humans also, with development, having more ecosystems, more resorts near coral reefs, a lot more garbage, a lot more people to use the coral reefs that can damage it. But definitely we're seeing the effects of climate change on coral reefs. Okay, so here's the ecosystems of North America. We do have a few coral reefs, like off of, starting with like South Carolina, Florida, and Mexico in North America. So let's talk about deserts. Deserts sometimes look like this, where there's very sparse green, but when it rains, you get these really massive blooms. So they can be very colorful. For the exam, just know the basic details that are given here about each ecosystem. So that if I say, what ecosystem has less than 10 inches of water per year, has very sparse, evenly distributed plants, and animals that are precisely adapted to life in this ecosystem, you would choose A, B, C, D, E, desert. The animals, for example, are colored like sand because sand is very prevalent, so that they can camouflage in with the sand. And they're often active at night when it's cooler, so they will have big eyes, so it can take in a lot of moonlight. Deserts are found in the southwest United States and down into Mexico. Grasslands. We have grasslands here. Our area was actually a lot more grassland. Everywhere in Illinois that there's farmland was prairie grassland before humans came and occupied it. Hot, dry summers. I read that we're heading into probably one of our hottest summers ever, which I like. I like hot weather. Lots and lots of flowers in these areas, but also a good diversity of organisms. If we go back to before we had farmland, there were free roaming buffalo or bison. And then you could see a variety of different kinds of mammals, birds, cats, reptiles. So we had a very diverse amount of bigger animals out in our prairies, as well as a good diversity of organisms. A lot of migrational organisms go through the prairie area because it is very diverse with plants. I just read too that this next week, look out for birds because a lot of birds are migrating through this coming week. So you'll see all kinds of strange birds coming through. All right, temperate deciduous forest, another one of our common ecosystems, just like our forests out here, our forest preserves, lots and lots of trees. You can see that they're found in the Midwest and the Southwest and South Mid, and then the East Coast. So lots of trees. Trees can support a great variety of organisms. We don't have as many black bears here, but if you go up into northern Michigan, you'll see black bears. We do have a lot of deer, a lot of migrational birds, as I just mentioned. Temperate rainforest found on the West Coast. So you can find it up into Alaska and down the West Coast. It's cooler than a tropical rainforest. Temperate rainforest can get a little bit colder, even get snow, but you see a real diversity of different kinds of plant life. That's all I say about that. Okay, northern carnivorous forest, or taiga, where you see a lot of lumber mills happening. It's evergreen trees, that you will see mostly in those areas. They are green even in the snow. And you do have also a variety of different kinds of animals as well. So the taiga details that you should know, mostly evergreens. Most of the animals there are mammals. You can see it through the west part of the United States, and then a lot through Canada and Alaska. And like I mentioned, big sources of lumber. Those evergreen trees give us a lot of that. And then the last one I want to mention is the tundra. When we go far north into our coldest areas, will look like this the majority of the year, but if you have a warming period, kind of like the desert where you just get things will flower very quickly. Animals that are mostly white, Arctic fox, the snowy owl, polar bears. In growing seasons, they will molt and get these different colorations to match. You can see the snowy owl too. Really, really harsh weather. Not a lot of species are supported here. So very little diversity. Every animal is very, very precisely adapted to cold. All right, so let's talk lastly about some of the solutions. So here's our bio again. We use that word a lot in ecology. Biodiversity, the diversity of the living things. Biodiversity is not only the amount of living things or the variety of those living things, but how they interact with one another. So let's talk about current species diversity. It's really hard to count all of the species on the earth, but here are some figures, and I know we talked about some of these before, that there's about 1.75 million species that are identified, but some people believe there might be like a billion still yet to be identified out there. There's so much to discover. The majority, I know we talked about this when we talked about diversity of life. The majority of species that are identified are animals and then plants. And then as we get smaller and smaller, which these organisms are harder to study because you might need a microscope or a lot of tools, that we have less identified. The term extinction means that all members of the species are gone. Nobody has seen a member of that species for a while. Did you miss something? Are you okay? You're okay. I know a lot of this I'm just like trying to go through because some of it I've talked about here before. Mass extinction means that you have the loss of a lot of species very, very quickly. Are you guys missing some of this? Okay. So some of the books are from, I think, 2 semesters ago. I'll post this. I'm not testing on a lot of what we're talking about today. So just more FYIs. What? Yeah, this lecture, the biodiversity lecture, I'm trying to think. I don't think I have like really any questions on it. If I'll look over the exam. If there's anything I'm like, oh, wait, pay attention to this, I'll send you a message tonight that what you should pay attention to. So most of this is just listen. A lot of it I've talked about already, so.
Do you know what the statistics, like number-wise?
No. No statistics, no. Yeah. No, the majority of this stuff is just FYI kind of things. All right, human activities have a major impact on biodiversity. So a lot of this we've talked about. Destruction of habitats. exotic or invasive species, I know we've talked about, and then over-harvesting, meaning that we're taking too much from an ecosystem. So let's look at this question. Why is the conservation of every organism in an ecosystem, even the bacteria or a single species of frog, important? A, losing a single species always leads to the demise of the entire ecosystem. Does it always? No. If we're talking about, if I said losing a keystone species often leads to the demise of an ecosystem, would that be true? Yeah, so if we're talking specifically about keystone species, and maybe not always as well. Human health depends on every organism and an ecosystem doing their job. No. Each species has a role or job in their ecosystem. That one sounds a lot better than those two. Every species is economically valuable to humans. No, so this one is the best. So aren't you glad you're in here? All right, so if we're just looking at humans and the importance of biodiversity, one of the things that a lot of humans will focus on is what we call ecosystem services. All the things that other organisms can do for us. How they help us build stuff, how they recycle our air, how they give us food. So we'll take a look at a chart here. And here is the ways that we directly receive those services. And then some of them are less direct. For example, like I'm going to go on Saturday, I'm going to the Garfield Park Conservatory to buy my vegetables for the summer. So that would be more of like an indirect way. Okay, a little bit about different people who study ecology. One is an ecologist. They study the relationship between biotic and abiotic factors. I mentioned before the biogeographer. They're considered under this ecology umbrella. Ecologists might be called field scientists, biogeographers, lab scientists, museum scientists, nature center scientists, educators. Some of them are advisors. I work, like for example, my background is kind of like, is more marine biology, but marine ecology. I've worked with NASA advising them on some projects that they were going to provide to educators. Most of the time, ecologists require an undergraduate degree, often a master's degree, but one of the nice things about ecology is that you could get into a company. I interviewed for a company right out of undergrad, and it was looking at the biodiversity and nutrients in an ecosystem, where they would put me into the field immediately with not having that specific training. And somebody from the company who'd been there for a while, I would like work with them or shadow them until I had enough skills to go into areas by myself. So sometimes there's like kind of nice things where you will find in ecology or other fields that you get the training on the job. So that's kind of nice too. Conservation biologists specifically study endangered species, or maybe species that are being affected, that have an effect on the greater ecosystem. So for example, like elephants, a person who's a conservation biologist may study what are elephants doing, how are they being affected by humans, what's going on with the decline in that population, because they are so critical, they are keystone species to their ecosystem. In ecology, you often will have a lot of overlap between natural scientists, ecologists, like I'm a marine biologist, educators, people who work in museums. So a lot of times you have a lot of people for different technical skill sets working together. So there is what we call ecological economics, that the more that we can protect the natural systems in our world, the less it costs humans. So, for example, there was in New York City, water comes down from the northern mountains around New York City. And the Catskill Mountains specifically provide them with a lot of their water to New York City. There was a company that was lobbying on this mountain to make homes, to make this huge development, which was going to interfere with the water that came down the mountain. As the water comes down the mountain, all of the plants and the D&Ds are purifying that water. So there's less cost of water purification because there's such a diversity of species on this mountain as the water trickles. Because someone had done a study on this water purification and the economic benefits, that they were like, no, this is going to really cost New York City a ton of money. We're going to have to put a lot more into our water purification system, and it's going to be a huge cost. And so they said, no, we're not going to do that. So in this project, because this study was done about the water purification of this particular mountain ecosystem, they had the data, ecologists or whoever technically was doing it, where they were able to take that data and shut down this human development because it costs money. And so that's what I mean by ecological economics. Just like out there in the prairie for what a lot of people are doing as they are building. Let's say that we were going to put in another campus building and get rid of this parking lot here. What a builder might do is a builder with some knowledge of ecosystems might say, hey, if we're going to put a new building out there, you have a wetland. Wetlands have a lot of organisms, a lot of those D&Ds who can bioremediate water and toxins. That what you can do, and what a lot of people are doing now, is they're proposing that the waste systems go into the ecosystem. The ecosystem will break down all of the toxic chemicals naturally, and then we filter that water back through a purification system into the buildings. And so a lot of times builders now, what they're looking at is if it's surrounded by natural systems, like how can we use those natural systems to save money and also make us healthier? So that's like a really cool, could be a job if you were like, I kind of want to go into architecture, but I also really like ecology. That's a way to have these two specialties together to be something really unique. All right, so value of ecosystem services. It's hard to put a number on it because we just don't even know what we don't know yet. But every year, ecosystem services provide us with trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars. So there's a lot of money. If you're somebody who's really interested in this concept, there's a lot of money out there to be saved. How do we measure biodiversity? Well, it's probably impossible to do so. Usually they just kind of do surveys and count species, but there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. The biggest thing is just biodiversity is really an estimate because we just don't know. We're not sure. There's so many species to be discovered. Oh, I do want to mention. So advancements in molecular technology have allowed us to study biodiversity more. That when they have, let's say, a fungus and it's bright yellow, we saw a video last week of a bright yellow fungus, and there's one, they could look at two of them in an ecosystem and run the DNA on them and see, are they the same thing or are they different? So it's another way we're just adding to our biodiversity numbers. There are biodiversity hotspots closer to the equator. We'll have often more species that we're looking at ways governments, non-governmental organizations called NGOs are looking to work with governments and say we should protect this and why. And a lot of times, again, it's the ecosystem services and the cost, the economics of it, that they're bringing that to them and saying you can actually save money if you save species. If you took 111, you may have done an ecological footprint. That is your effect on the earth based on how you use the earth. Your eco footprint will be lower if you eat lower on the trophic levels. The biggest thing for most of us Americans is travel. We use, well, houses. Let me say travel first. So travel, we drive a lot. Also, we fly a lot. And so those are two huge impacts on your ecological footprint. And the other thing is, how big of a house do you have? How much energy do you have to heat and cool and plug things in? The more space, the more stuff, the more electric you pay for. Okay, so let's talk about biocapacity. Bio again, we have a lot of those bio words. Biocapacity means that if we take a look at how many Earths the average person needs to live their life, this is related to the ecological footprint, that as I have done mine before, because of my travel and the amount that I drive, mine is 3.8 Earths. How can I live on 3.8 Earths, right? I can't. So I'm going way over my use or my biocapacity. Biocapacity, then they translate it in how many acres that you use, that on average, every person on the earth needs 5.2 acres to live their life, but on average, every person uses 6.7. So we are over the amount of earth that we actually utilize. And we know that there's a cost to that. On average, humans need 1.3 Earths each to support their life. Again, we only have one. So we have to really get that down. Again, our footprint is bigger. Our footprint is getting bigger as time goes on. Okay, a little bit of idea about sustainable development. When we're talking about sustainability, sustainability means how do we meet our current needs without affecting the needs of future generations in a negative way? Sustainability has three pillars. It's not only environmental use, it's the economics, and it's also how we treat other people or the social justice aspect of it. So how do we keep all three of those in check? Sustainable development means that, like, if you have a company and you're sustainably developing your company, you don't have an impact on the earth by what you produce. You have employees that are treated well and fairly. They get good health care, they get a good living wage, and you still make a profit. And that's what a sustainable company does, those three things. Some people are making what do we call reserves, that they'll have areas that they're like, nope, you can't go into this area. Or maybe you can only hike into this area. There's different, when we're talking about a reserve, it means that we're protecting this area from human use. There's a lot of levels to that. So, for example, here, a biosphere reserve means that you have a core area where humans can't enter. They're cut off. You have a buffer zone, which means maybe they can hike or camp in that area. And then you have a transition area that maybe the parking lots are outside of this transition area. Okay, so who cares? Yeah, you should, right? We all should care. Blah, 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 blah. Let's talk about a few things. Now, we'll that's all common sense. Okay, I think we talked about most of it anyway. A study that we have going on, or a new field of development, involves biomimicry. So how do we use, I don't think you may or may not have this, I don't know. Oh, that's it. So just let me tell you this, biomimicry, when we were talking about like utilizing the wetlands to recycle stuff, there are a lot of developers or a lot of different businesses that study living things, and they see, well, a living thing does it like this, so how could I make my mechanical system do it more similar to that? How can I mimic living things to do whatever I need to do in this world better? It's just another kind of principle that a lot of people are thinking about, is just using nature ideas to make things better, make systems better. That's biomimicry. Okay, so that's it. I will post this. I'll look over the exam. I'll see if there's any questions in this last part of lecture, and I will tell you to study that specific part, just to be fair. Okay.